In this modeling series, I'm going to show you how to model different types of windows in Maya. In the first video, we're going to start with the most basic and simple window, but it's going to show you all the techniques that we're going to use throughout, including in this video and the rest of the videos in the series, as well as some concepts that we're going to build on. So the first thing we need is a wall. Most of the windows are part of a wall, so we need to have a wall that we're going to cut the window out from. So I'm going to create a cube. And I'm going to make it larger. So I'm going to use the size of 300 in width and height. This is a good height and width in centimeters. That gives us pretty good proportion for an average size wall. And it also works pretty well in Unreal Engine. So inside the inputs tab, I'm going to set width to 300, height to 300, and depth. Good value to use is 20. And then I'm going to set height baseline to -1. This will place my mesh on top of the grid. So I don't have to mess around with pivot points. This is something new in 2023. So for most of the examples, this is what we're going to use. I'm going to take this mesh and I'm going to duplicate it, move it off to the side so I can reintroduce it back. I don't have to create it every time. So the most basic type of window is a wall with a cutout, almost like a window frame, with a cut through with no geometry in between. So let's create that because it's going to give us the techniques that we're going to use throughout for more detailed windows. So I'm going to switch over to face component mode. And one thing I want to point out is I'm going to have the front and the back face both in the mesh for this wall. A lot of times you can delete the back face if you're not going to create geometry there. So you can go ahead and delete it and just work with the front one, or you can keep it. I tend to keep it because I like to keep the modular meshes that I create more solid than just a single flat plane. So I'm going to keep both of those faces here. And in this scenario, I am going to switch over to faces and select both faces, the front and the back. So both are going to be selected as I work on this. But in some scenarios, I'll just select just the front face and not the back. So it's just a matter of, do you want to have an interior and an exterior for this wall and the window, or you just want just the front and the back will be a single flat plane. It all depends on your scenario of the mesh you're trying to create. So I have both faces selected. I'm going to hit Control E to extrude. And with the window popped up here, I'm going to hover over the offset, left click, hold, and drag, and then begin to set an offset. So this will give me an extra face for where the window will be. Now this is going to give me a square ratio. So I can actually come in here and I have my XYZ gizmos for scale, which are the little cubes. And I can hover over the red one, which is the X. And I'm just going to left click, hold, and drag and begin to scale on the X axis. So the offset gave me the extrusion, but then I can go ahead and scale so it's not so square and so uniform. And I can also do this on Y. So I'll just come in here and I'm just going to create an average size window, something like this. And then all I'm going to do for this example is I'm just going to hit W to exit the poly extrude. And then I'm going to hit delete with those faces still selected. So they're removed. So that gives me the cutout for the window frame. And then the last option, or the last step for this very quick, simple example is I'm going to switch over to edge component mode. And right now we can see right through the geometry. So I'm going to select both of these edges and I'm going to select one by left clicking on it, hold shift, add to a selection for this edge. And we need to create a face so we close off that gap. So with both edges selected, I'm going to come over to the modeling toolkit, left click on the tab to expose it. If you don't see this, you may have to come up here right below the workspace on the top right and enable to show and hide the model toolkit. And then I'm going to bridge. Bridging will create a face between selected edges. And I'm going to do this for all of the edges around. So I'm going to left click on one, hold shift, left click on another, bridge, and do one more time for the bottom. And then switch over back to object mode. And here I've created a cutout, or I guess you could say a very low poly, simple window on a wall. But the use of this technique, extrusion with offset, and then extrusion with thickness, will be kind of our foundation for a lot of the things we're going to do. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to duplicate it. Actually, I'm just going to move it. I'm not going to duplicate this. I'm going to move this. This is our first example and the most simplistic example that you may see on some other tutorials. And then I'm going to take and I'm going to duplicate this wall that I created so I can bring it back to my world origin. And I'm just going to use this for our next example. I'm going to put some detail into this. So let me go ahead and set this in the world origin. I'm going to go to channel box and just put 0 and translate. And we're back in world origin, as if we just created this cube, this wall. So for this example, I'm only going to select the front face, not the back. The back I'm going to keep flat, as if I don't have anything for the interior. And this is just gonna, just imagine this is just only an exterior wall with a window, and there's nothing to see through, and there's not going to be an interior. So with this face selected, I am going to extrude, Control E, and I'm gonna start my offset. And then I'm gonna come in here and begin to offset on specific axes, so it's not so uniform, so square. I can also switch over to, let's say, front view, so that way I can see my scale reference and I can kind of judge how big this window needs to be. If you ever accidentally leave the extrusion, and now you're back, let's say, to object mode, and you want to go ahead and maybe scale this face further, you just need to switch over to face component mode, select the face, and continue scaling on X and on Y, so you can still adjust it after the fact. So let's say this is the size that I like, and now I'm going to go ahead and do another extrusion, Control E, and in this case I'm going to adjust my thickness and push it in a negative value. So I can go ahead and left click, hold, and drag over the text to adjust, see what my thickness would be, or I can come in here and type in the value, so let's say -5. So this kind of gives me a little bit more control, and it looks a little bit better than just a window frame. Now it still doesn't have a lot of definition, so usually windows, especially for like let's say a single pane or a fixed picture style window, you have a frame and then you have glass. So let's go ahead and create that kind of frame area. So actually maybe in this case, let me adjust my thickness, let's say -3. And then for this, I'm going to do another extrusion. So we just did an extrusion with thickness, and then I'm going to do another extrusion, Control E, and in this case, I'm going to adjust my offset. So that gives me a bit of a border. So let's say 3. And then I'm going to do another extrusion, Control E. And in this case, I'm going to do thickness and push at a negative value as well. So let's do a -2.5. Go back to object mode, and here's what we have. We have a single pane or fixed style picture window. We have a frame, and this would be the glass. And it's inside the wall. Now this is pretty low poly, and in certain cases this will work as is. If you don't need to add extra geometry in here. If you're trying to keep it low poly, you just keep the edges as 90-degree corners and just move on. But a lot of times you want to add a bit of an extra bevel around the corners so you don't have that 90-degree corner. So in this case, I'm gonna kind of do another pass on this. So let me make a copy of this. So I have a low poly. And the way I'm making duplicates is I'm selecting the mesh, hitting Control D, and just moving it off to the side. And that creates a copy, duplicate. So I'm gonna come in here, I'm gonna select the edges, switch over to edge component mode, and I'm gonna select the outer edges right here first. So those I'm gonna bevel first. So I'm gonna select these edges, these 4 edges, I'm gonna hit Control B to bevel, and just kind of zoom in so I can see it. So this is gonna create a rounded corner, and any corner, a 90-degree corner that you give a bevel to just gives you extra geometry, and it looks much nicer when it's rendered and when the light hits it. So when your polygon count is not an issue, and you can just kind of do whatever you need to do just to make it look good, you should bevel your corners. So in this case, you can either do a segment of 1 and just adjust your fraction. So let's say 0.2, something like this. And just leave it as is. This would be pretty good for more lower poly, but then in my case, I'm gonna actually bump it up to 2. So that gives more of a rounded appearance. I usually don't go anything above 2 unless I need it. And for corners like this, I usually stick with 2 when the polygon count is not an issue. And I think 0.2 of a fraction is pretty good for this. I'm gonna switch over back to object mode. And just to see it without the wireframe, I'm gonna hit Alt 5 to kind of toggle wireframe unshaded on and off. And you can see that already looks much better. The lighting hits much, just when the light hits that corner, you can see that highlight versus the 90-degree corner. And now I'm going to do the same thing for this. I'm going to double click on this edge and it should select all the way around, and it does. So now I have 4 selected for the frame, and I'm going to hit Control B again and to bevel. And then for this, I'm going to also give 2 and let's say 0.3. Switch back just to see what it looks like. And I have a nicer frame for the window. Let me hit Alt 5 to bring back my wireframe unshaded. And here is a very nice, better looking window, a simple single fixed window with extra bevels. Now, if you need to modify the window after the fact, let's say you want to make this window smaller or bigger, you have to be very careful using the scale tool. So if you have bevels on your geometry, anytime you try to scale in order to resize certain portions of your geometry, the bevels will begin to kind of grow bigger or smaller depending on how much you're scaling. So for example, if I switch over to Vertices, and let's say I want to make this window smaller. If I come over to my front view, switch over to scale tool, and I begin to scale them, you can see that my bevels are beginning to narrow down and crunch and get compressed. So if you have bevels in your geometry, you should avoid trying to scale. In this case, if I wanted to adjust the window size, I would just have to move certain portions of my geometry and not scale them. So let's say I wanted to just maybe make small adjustments, or even just make bigger adjustments. Maybe I wanted to duplicate this wall. Let's say I have this, I'm gonna make a copy of it. And I'm just gonna select the bottom vertices, just move this up. So now I have two versions of a window without much work. Now let me go ahead and move this window back. And I'm just going to move these and just keep a copy of them. And I'm going to make a duplicate of this, bring it back to world origin. And I'm going to show you a few more things. One thing I tend to do, and I like to do over the method that I showed you for the initial extrusion of the window, is instead of selecting the faces and then pressing Ctrl E and just doing an offset and then doing a scale, a freehand scale, I like to insert multi-cuts or insert additional edges and then snap those edges to the grid. So that way I can eventually, if I need to, extract that window and have that window be also a modular element, a separate modular element. So what I mean by this is, this is how we did most of our windows by now. And when you take a look in your view, this window, if I were to extract that window and have it a separate piece of geometry that I can just kind of maybe swap, but keep the wall as is, you can see that it's not really aligned to the grid. And that would be a problem if I were to extract and have that window separate. Now, this is not a problem at all. This is what you would do and what you should do if the window and the wall are one single unit, one single piece of geometry. But I'm going to show you how to be able to extract your windows and have them be separate. So that way you can maybe have that window be opened, closed, or you just maybe swap for another window that's the same size within the same wall. So instead of using this method, I'm going to go ahead and undo. And I'm going to switch over to Model and Toolkit and use multi-cut. And I'm going to hold Control. This will allow me to insert extra edges into my geometry. And I'm just going to insert a couple of edges vertically and a couple of edges horizontally. And then switch over to front view. Now, right now, they're not aligned to the grid. But because I've inserted those edges, I will be able to just snap those edges to the grid lines. And my window will also be on the grid if I am going to extract it as a separate piece of geometry later on. Now, just as a little side note, my grid options are, and I've done the video on this before, and I recommend you watch it, but my grid options are always set to these. So let me go to Display, Grid Options, and I currently have length and width set to 2000, grid lines every 10 units, and subdivision set to 1. The most important part here is the grid lines every so many units. That means that each grid unit is 10 centimeters. So I'm going to switch over to Edge Component mode. I'm going to double click on this edge. It selects the entire edge loop all the way around. And I'm going to start snapping these to the grid lines. So essentially, I'm going to recreate where the window cutout would be. So I'm going to hold X and just start dragging on the X axis. And just that way, it's that edge, all those edges are snapped to the grid. And I'm going to double click on this edge, hold X, also start dragging on the X axis. So that gives me the ability to snap those edges to the grid. And the way I model, I tend to be very precise. I like to be very specific to my dimensions and where specific lines go, especially for modular geometry. So I've kind of counted how many squares I have on each side, so that way the window is right in the center. And then I'm just going to double click on this edge, all those edges actually, and then hold X and just snap those. Let's say here. I think that's, and then I'm going to also snap these. So I think that's pretty good kind of size for where the window would be based on my scale reference. And now if I zoom in, this area these two faces, the front and the back, are now exactly aligned to the grid. And that's going to come in very important later on. So now I have the front and the back in this case selected, because I want to be able to detach these faces eventually where the window is and have that a separate piece of geometry that I can do something with. So now let's go ahead and model using the same techniques we've done so far with extrusion and maybe bevel, and do the extrusion to both sides so they're exactly the same. So I'm going to select those both faces, Control E to extrude. Let's do an offset first. Actually, in this case, no offset. Let's do a thickness. And I don't want to push it too far where it begins to overlap with the other face. So let me go into side view and let me adjust my thickness to something like this. Not too far. So let's do -4 because I want to have a little bit of a border like we did before. And now let's do another extrusion, but now this time it's going to be offset. And let's do 5. Well, let's do 4. Just kind of keep it the same. Doesn't matter. You just, as long as you have a reference that you're kind of going off of, and it looks visually appealing to the thickness of the border that you would want for that window. And then let's do another extrusion. And in this case, we're going to add thickness. And let me go ahead and take a look from the side. Just close enough to where those two faces are almost touching each other, but not overlapping. So essentially, I'll have glass on both sides. Now, there are other ways to do glass. I could delete both of those faces and then only have one single plane that will be double-sided. But that's when you get to rendering and creating materials for glass. Right now, we're just modeling. So here's our geometry for both sides. So before I kind of extract it and have a separate piece of geometry, let's do our pass for bevels. I'm not going to do this on every single piece of geometry, as long as you know how to kind of add extra geometry for bevels, so you have a nice little looking corners. You'll be able to repeat this for the rest of the windows or for any type of geometry you need. But I'll just kind of keep it the same for this video. So I've selected all 8 edges for both sides, 4 on this, 4 on the other. I'm going to hit Control B to bevel. Let's go ahead and do 2 segments and maybe a smaller fraction. Let's do 0.2. And then I'm going to double click on this and do the same thing for the other side. So I have 8 selected here, and I'm going to hit Control B to bevel. And let's do fraction of 0.2 and then 2 segments. Switch over back to object mode. Let me hit Alt 5 just to see if it looks nice, and it does. And now once you've modeled the window as part of the wall and we've pre-planned ahead of time, that's what we're going to do. So we made sure that this window is aligned to the grid. Now it doesn't have to be aligned to the grid, but if it's going to be a modular piece of geometry that you kind of swap, like I've mentioned, then it should be aligned to the grid, especially if you're going to take this into Unreal Engine. We can now take this window, let's switch over to face component mode and extract it as a separate piece of geometry. So we'll have the wall and we'll have the window both separate. So to do this, all you have to do is select all the faces that you want to extract. So we can go to front view and just kind of carefully marquee select what we would want to extract, then add to a selection. However, this is pretty symmetrical object, and there's an easier way to make your selections. Actually, I've already selected what I needed to select. Yeah, I've selected the window that I would extract, because that's part of the wall right here. That's the wall, and this is the window. What I was going to show you is you can actually select, let's say, just a glass, and then you go to select, and then you grow your selection. And the shortcut key for grow and shrink your selections is Shift period and Shift comma. This will grow your selection. So now I'm going to use my shortcut key. So Shift period in this case, it's going to start growing my selection. Select all the faces up until this point, and it's going to do this for both sides. Very useful shortcut key. And now I'm going to extract these faces as a separate piece of geometry. So you go to Edit Mesh and Extract. Switch over to Object Component Mode. Deselect the object. And just select your objects and just to see if it extracted. And it did. So now we have the wall and now we have the window. Actually, we have the window front and the back as separate, but I want them together. I want the front and the back together as one. So I'm going to select these two meshes and let's combine them back together. Go to mesh, combine. So now they're together. Now, whenever you extract your pieces of geometry, you will have those gaps, just like we did when I showed you the most basic wall. So all we need to do to fix this is bridge them. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to select the wall and I'm going to hit Control-1 to isolate select. This will only show me what I have selected. Great shortcut key to use. Use it all the time. Then I'm going to switch over to edge and I'm just going to select these two edges. In my modeling toolkit, I'm going to bridge. And I'm going to do this to close up all these gaps. Bridge this. I'll show you how to fix this in a moment. And let's bridge this. Whenever you see this lime green color, that means the material is missing. Maya doesn't know what to assign. So usually happens during bridging. So all you do is you go back to object mode, then right click, hold on object and go to assign existing material and then assign Lambert 1. This is your default material. It will fix it. Now press Ctrl-1 to bring everything back. Now select the window, press Ctrl-1 to isolate, select the window only. And what I want to do, I want to do the same thing for this window. I want to close up this gap. So here's what I want to do. Let me bring everything back. The reason I am trying to close up those gaps is because I want to be able to maybe take this window and maybe rotate it. So that way I have a window opening and then I have kind of window opening with the window being, maybe opened up. But if we have any gaps in geometry, this will be see-through. So, we need to have some sort of geometry there. So let me go ahead and disable that. So I'm going to press Ctrl-1 to isolate select. And I'm going to select these edges and bridge them. Let's bridge this, bridge that, and then there is one more on the bottom. Select those two and bridge. Go back to object mode, hit Ctrl-1 to isolate select to bring everything back. And now the last thing, let me hit Alt-5 so I can see the wireframe. And the last thing for me is modify the pivot point so I can rotate the window in any way I want. So there are different types of windows that can be opened in many different ways. For this specific window, actually, there is a type of window that can be opened from its center pivot, like so. Actually, let me go ahead and fix that. I'm going to right click hold on this mesh. I just saw we were missing material. So let's do the same thing, existing material and Lambert 1. So this type of window is called center pivot window. And it actually can be used as this window is actually openable from this center pivot. So if that's the case, then you don't need to do anything. Other type of windows, they're opened like so from the top, and those are called awning windows. And there's regular openable windows where it's just, the hinges on one of the sides of the corners, and it's open from one corner to the other. So in order to modify the pivot point anywhere on your geometry, wherever you want, depends where you want to open the window from. The way you do this is you hold down D, and then you hold down V to snap to a vertex. So if I want to snap to this bottom vertex right here, hold D, V, middle mouse click and drag. This will snap to that bottom vertex. And then here's my pivot point. That's not been saved. And if I hit R, if I hit E actually for rotate, I can go ahead and rotate and just open the window out, for example. If I want to maybe have the window openable from the top, like an awning window, I just need to modify my pivot point. I'm just going to hold down D, V, middle mouse click and drag. I have an extensive video on showing you how to modify your pivot points in more detail. So I suggest you really check that out. So I've modified the pivot point to be at the top now. So all I need to do is just hit E to rotate and then just rotate my window to open it like an awning window. Let me undo. Or I can just keep that same pivot point and it'll be the same openable window as most windows that you see. Now, if this window is still kind of too thick, let me go ahead and I can adjust it. Now to scale, I could select all the vertices. And I know I mentioned that you shouldn't scale the vertices, but it's such a small distance that it may not impact the bevel that we created. Now, if it does, then I would just have to select the vertices on one side and just move them instead. So I'll just bring those in, select these, and then on the bottom, hold down Shift to add to a selection, bring this in, create a smaller window frame, or the window, not frame, but the window itself. Now, whenever you resize, or in this case, I've moved, the pivot point will be kept in the same spot. So I just need to remodify my pivot point. Hold D, V, middle mouse click and drag, snap it. Here's my new pivot point. And the window looks a little bit better. It's not so thick. Or maybe it's openable this way. So the reason we did it this way so we can extract it is first we can go ahead and have the window separate piece of geometry so we can open it. So maybe one window is just going to be as is. The other window within the wall is opened. So we have the same piece of geometry, but it looks a little different from one part of the house or building to the other. And also, if you had the same type of size window, but maybe with some extra detail, or maybe it's a whole separate window, but it's the same size, you could swap it. You could move this and bring the other window and just snap it to the grid and just place it right in there, and would fit perfectly as long as it's the same size. So this is why we had aligned all those lines before. And in Maya, it's not really a problem. We don't have to keep things on the grid, just makes it easier to snap. But the reason I did this is to show you that if I were to bring this into Unreal Engine and I had multiple windows, it would make it super easy for me to swap one window to another, place it somewhere else, because everything is more of a grid-based snapping system in Unreal. While in Maya, you can snap to vertices, you can snap to edges. It is a less forgiving with the snaps, but I tend to work this way where I align my lines, my edges to the grid, because I usually bring my meshes over to a game engine. So this was the first part of a multiple video series where we create various windows, and this was the introduction and kind of all the techniques, things that we're going to use in the rest of the videos, all shown in this one video as an introduction to the basics and a way to create good looking windows in Maya. Now, if you are just getting into Maya and some of the things that I've showed you went over your head, I recommend that you take a look at a very extensive and in-depth beginner tutorial course I created called Maya Foundation, the Home Study course. This will bring you up to speed on how to get started with Maya, how to model, show you all the modeling tools you need to know, and how to UV your objects. It will show you everything you need to know to get started with Maya.